Thank you so much for having me today. I think we need to have more events like this. I'm really excited to be here. I've learned a lot already this morning, and I'm excited about the next panel too, and ours, of course. We are an increasingly urban global society. As of today, it's estimated that about half of the world's population lives in cities. By 2030, we expect about 60% of the world's population, and by 2050, about 75% of all people on Earth are going to live in cities. There's an important sustainable development goal of sustainable cities. And what dovetails nicely with that is the notion of urban food production, which has really grown in popularity and also interest in the research world in the last 10 years. So I'm going to talk about an issue that's germane to soils and urban food production that I'd like to present as a consideration more so than a problem. I want to turn that frown upside down. Soil contamination is something that I think we need to be cognizant of. I think there are things we can do about it to solve that problem, but we need to not observe it as a barrier to sustainable food production in cities. I'm the PI on the Safe Urban Harvest Study, which I'm going to talk very briefly about in a moment, which is an exploration into urban food production and how exposure to contaminants through contact with soils and through the consumption of urban-grown and other produce may impact human health. And ultimately, how can we take participants in urban agriculture and help them avoid unnecessary exposure to soil contaminants wherever possible in an affordable way. So my research, or our research more broadly, is going to highlight some needs and really immediate term opportunities to better characterize the issue and respond to it in a way that allows people to participate in a very safe and healthy manner. So a little bit of background on contaminant exposure for those that may not be so familiar with it. This is a beautiful graphic that was drawn by a member of our team that documents some examples of the way contamination finds its way into the environment through human and natural sources. What it also documents, which is a piece of the puzzle that gets a whole lot less attention, is the different ways in which people come into contact with soil and produce and the contaminants that may exist therein. So I can show this again later to anyone that's interested, and I'm happy to hear that our slides are going to be distributed. But within the world of contaminant exposure, I wanted to cover a few bases as background. So there are lots of things that people do, like burning coal, like tearing down houses with lead paint, etc., that can introduce these types of contamination into the environment. And in the world of looking at soil contamination in the context of urban agriculture at least, there's been a laser focus on heavy metals. With good reason. Heavy metals are likely to occur in urban environments, but I'd like to just throw it out there that we should be broadening our focus to some of the other organic and synthetic chemicals that may persist and lead to human exposures as well. Some of those might be PAHs, PCBs, pesticides, and many, many others that are all relevant to health. I wanted to pay a little bit of attention to who might become exposed in the urban environment or through the consumption of urban-grown produce. So obviously those directly involved in the cultivation of urban soils, the harvesting of food, they're children who might play in urban agricultural sites. And I think Dr. Paulson said it very nicely today. Despite what my children would tell you, children are not little adults. And they are, per unit body weight, more exposed when they come into contact with soils. And they may have a differential vulnerability to that exposure when they come into contact with those chemicals. So they are especially important to protect in this context. We generally tend to think about consumers, right? Because most of us are consumers and they are the broadest exposed population. But in my own perspective, based on the data we've generated thus far, I actually am more worried about the people who are cultivating the soils because they are going to have a good deal more contact with contamination. Lastly, people can be exposed by a variety of environmental routes and pathways, so through inhalation of dust, through accidental or incidental ingestion of soil, and of course, dermal contact with soil. And again, we're often more focusing on folks who are going to consume the produce that may have either dust adhered to its surface or may consume contaminants that have accumulated in the tissue of what's grown in cities. So the Safe Urban Harvest Study, which I mentioned before, is an ongoing piece of research that we have going now that's expanding in many different directions, but it involves 104 unique farms and community gardens all around Baltimore City and every part of the city. And what the study entails is a survey of production practices. So what are the inputs? Who's spending time on site? What are their activities while they're on site? What are they growing? And we're also doing some environmental and food testing. So we're testing an array of different types of soils from each site, including growing and non-growing soils. We're testing irrigation water, and we're testing the produce that's being grown on the farms, 13 different produce items. We are also, for comparative purposes, looking at produce from the grocery store, both conventional and organic, and we're expanding that to look at peri-urban produce, or produce grown in regions surrounding Baltimore as far as 3 hours away, but not grown organically and not grown in the city. So we'll have a nice set of comparisons when our data are fully in. Doing this type of research is an enormous effort. In addition to the army of terrific students we have that have helped us do what we're doing, we have a series of partners both on the research and community side. This couldn't have been possible without colleagues from the USDA Agricultural Research Service, but we also partner with the Baltimore City government and NGOs that support urban agriculture within the city to help us with where we really need a boost, and that's in really communication and community interaction, which is not an afterthought in our study and should never be an afterthought in this type of work. It's actually been an area where, a disproportionately large amount of the effort has been applied. The greatest challenges that come out of doing this type of research are interpretation of the data. So if you get a soil test and you get the results back, you might get a number, and some of the better labs might give you a slight interpretation of that number. But what's been really challenging is trying to make sure that the materials that we generate to explain our results to the participating farms and gardens make sense and give them a means to deal with the information or resolve their situations if the results may indicate that there is some soil contamination there. And we found that we are dealing with a very diverse and engaged population with differential levels of environmental health literacy. So it has been a bit of a challenge, but one that we've really enjoyed working through to make sure that what we come up with is intelligible to anyone other than risk assessors. So we think that the work that we've done and the model that we've put together to deal with the issue of urban soil contamination is something that we can scale up and deploy in other cities, possibly even internationally. And so I would like not only to look at other geographic areas, but I would like to broaden our contaminant suite too, to some of the other contaminants that may be newer territory for the field. To do this work, we really need a transdisciplinary team, not only of scientists, but also community partners as well. So I'm a risk guy. So happy to hear Pat talk extensively about the need for risk assessment in various agency activities, but certainly here risk assessment and risk communication are key competencies that are needed to do this type of work, and that means integrating information about toxicology, epidemiology, but we also need soil scientists, we need chemists, we need exposure scientists, and more importantly, it's helpful to have insights from people who work with communities, because if we try and do this in a bubble, the outreach and deployment of results would be an abject disaster. We think that in order to set this up in other cities, we would need to first go and find very strong community partnerships, people who can help us identify farms and gardens, which is an enormous part of the challenge, and also people who have established trust with the urban agriculture community. It takes a fair amount of trust to be established before someone's going to let you onto their site to sample. And it also takes the establishment of trust to convince some of our partners that we are not going to create a very negative news story that's going to change the public's perceptions of the safety of urban-grown produce. That is a real concern, especially for some of the urban farmers who make their living selling urban-grown produce. So that is something that we're very sensitive to not create an alarmist narrative, but really to create something that's accurate and helpful to the people who are engaged and the people who may consider eating that food. If we were to do this in another city, now that we've developed an approach and a methodology, we're excited again to go elsewhere. We have a pilot study in Chicago right now beyond our work in Baltimore, and this can really be done in a 2-year period if we work super hard and stay on schedule. A project like this is expensive because it requires a lot of, manpower and communication time, but we believe, based on our estimation, that this could be done in other cities for around $750 to $1 million. There are a lot of potential funding sources for this. This is very translational, so it dovetails nicely with some of the recent priorities of the NIEHS. There are other funding sources like the USDA, who has been an essential partner in our work thus far, and hopefully a partner ongoing into the future. There are other organizations like FAR and maybe some other foundations that would be interested in supporting our work. But I think that's all I've got, so thanks.